Imagine standing in the cold corridors of the Tower of London on a misty morning in 1536. The heavy footsteps of yeoman guards echo on the stone floors, and there, a young, beautiful woman who was once Queen of England, now walks with trembling legs toward the scaffold. She's only 35 years old. Her name is Anne Boleyn. But this story doesn't end with Anne. This is the story of 6 extraordinary women. Women who loved, lived, and some who died for one man who might be the most notorious tyrant king in English history, Henry VIII. If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this, and drop a comment to tell me where you're listening from. I love knowing that we're exploring these dark secrets of history together, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity. Now, let's return to the story. To understand the story of 6 wives, we must first understand the man who married them. Henry Tudor was born into a world where royal survival depended on having a male heir. In 1491, when Henry was born at Greenwich Palace, his father, Henry VII, was still struggling to consolidate the newly established Tudor dynasty. England had just emerged from 3 decades of devastating civil war, the Wars of the Roses, where noble families slaughtered each other for the throne. Young Henry grew up as a spare prince. His older brother Arthur was destined to be king. Henry was raised in luxury, learning Latin, French, theology, music, and the arts of warfare. He stood 6 feet tall, powerfully built, with brilliant golden hair and piercing blue eyes. Courtiers described him as a living Apollo, handsome, intelligent, and bursting with vitality. But then fate intervened. In 1502, Arthur suddenly died at age 15 from a mysterious fever, just months after marrying Catherine of Aragon of Spain. Suddenly, Henry, then 11 years old, became the sole heir to England's throne. When Henry VII died in 1509, Henry VIII ascended the throne at 17, with all the power, confidence, and most importantly, an obsession with producing a male heir to ensure the Tudor dynasty's survival. And so, the tragedy began. Catherine of Aragon wasn't a choice of love. She was a political decision, a necessary alliance between England and Spain. But when Henry first saw her at their wedding in 1509, perhaps he felt something resembling love. Catherine was 23, noble and deeply religious. She had long golden hair and clear blue eyes. More importantly, she was the daughter of Los Reyes Católicos, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who had just completed the Reconquista and sponsored Christopher Columbus's discovery of America. The early years of their marriage seemed happy. Henry and Catherine danced together, hunted together, enjoyed music together. Henry wrote love poems for his wife and showered her with expensive gifts. Catherine became a beloved queen, charitable to the poor, protective of scholars, and always supportive of her husband. But there was a serious problem quietly developing. Catherine became pregnant multiple times, but most ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. In 1511, she gave birth to a son. Henry was temporarily overjoyed, but the child died after 52 days. Then another son in 1514 also died young, and then another in 1518. Only one child survived, Princess Mary, born in 1516. Catherine loved Mary with all her heart, but for Henry, a daughter couldn't solve the succession problem. In the 16th century world, a queen regnant was seen as a disaster waiting to happen. By 1525, Catherine was 40 and her childbearing years were nearly over. Henry began to believe their marriage was cursed by God. In the Bible, the book of Leviticus warned that if a man marries his brother's widow, they would be childless. Henry began convincing himself that his marriage to Catherine, his brother Arthur's widow, was sinful in God's eyes. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was another reason for Henry's change of heart. A reason with sparkling dark eyes and raven black hair. Anne Boleyn wasn't the most beautiful woman at court, but she had something far more dangerous: charisma. Born around 1501, Anne was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious courtier trying to elevate his family's status. Anne was sent to France as a child to learn European court etiquette. There, she mastered the subtle art of French feminine allure, how to converse wittily, dance gracefully, and most importantly, how to make men desire her. When Anne returned to England in 1522, she was like a breath of fresh air in Henry's traditional court. She was tall, slender, with long black hair and deep dark eyes. Many described her as having a neck like a swan and long, graceful fingers. Henry first noticed Anne when she was serving Queen Catherine. Initially he was interested in Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, and had an affair with her. But Anne was completely different. While Mary was compliant and submissive, Anne was intelligent, independent, and most importantly, she refused Henry's advances. In 1526, Henry began writing love letters to Anne. In one letter in French he wrote, "If you are willing to give yourself body and heart to me, who will be and have been your very loyal servant, I promise you that not only the name will be given to you, but also I will take you for my only mistress, casting all others out of my thoughts and affections for you alone." But Anne refused to become just another mistress. She wanted more. She wanted to become queen. And so, Henry began seeking to divorce Catherine. What happened next would shake Europe. Henry asked Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine, declaring the marriage invalid from the beginning. But the Pope, under pressure from Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and Catherine's nephew, refused. The crisis lasted 6 years. Catherine steadfastly refused to accept divorce, declaring she was Henry's lawful wife and would die with the title Queen of England. Henry grew increasingly angry and desperate. Anne grew increasingly impatient. Finally, Henry made a decision that would change world history. In 1533, Henry declared himself separate from the Roman Church and appointed himself head of the Church of England. He divorced Catherine himself and secretly married Anne, who was already pregnant. Anne Boleyn had achieved her dream. She had become Queen of England. But her glory would come at an unimaginable price. On September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth to her first child. Henry hoped for a male heir, but the baby was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. No one could know that this child would become one of the greatest queens in English history. But for Henry, Elizabeth was a disappointment. He had gambled his entire kingdom for Anne, and she had failed to give him what he wanted most. Worse, Anne continued to miscarry. In 1534, she lost a child. In 1536, she miscarried a son. This drove Henry to fury. More importantly, Henry was growing tired of Anne. She was no longer the young, alluring girl he'd fallen for. She had become sharp-tongued, demanding, and Henry felt controlled. Then Henry's eye fell on another woman, Jane Seymour, a quiet and gentle lady-in-waiting serving Anne. Jane was everything Anne was not, modest, gentle and submissive. But to marry Jane, Henry needed to escape from Anne. And unlike Catherine, who could be sent away and ignored, Anne knew too many secrets. She could be a threat to Henry. In May 1536, Anne was suddenly arrested on charges of adultery with 5 different men, including musician Mark Smeaton and even her own brother George Boleyn. These charges were almost certainly fabricated by Henry and his advisor Thomas Cromwell to provide grounds for eliminating Anne. The trial was merely theatre. The outcome was predetermined. On May 15, 1536, Anne Boleyn was sentenced to death. On May 19th, she walked onto the scaffold in the Tower of London. She wore a grey gown and a white cap. Before kneeling, she said, "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." The executioner, specially hired by Henry from France to ensure a quick death, beheaded Anne with a single stroke of his sword. 24 hours later, Henry married Jane Seymour. If Anne Boleyn was a tempest, then Jane Seymour was a gentle dawn after the storm. Jane was born around 1508 into a minor family in Wiltshire. Unlike Anne, Jane wasn't educated abroad or taught sophisticated arts of seduction. She was a simple country girl with pale blonde hair and fair skin. Henry was exhausted by drama and complexity. He wanted a wife who would give him peace and, most importantly, give him a son. Jane was perfect for this role. She was modest, religious, and completely submissive to Henry's will. She never interfered in politics or challenged her husband as Anne had done. Her motto was simple: bound to obey and serve. Henry and Jane's marriage proceeded smoothly. She made no enemies at court like Anne had. She even persuaded Henry to reconcile with his daughter Mary, who had been disinherited after the divorce from Catherine. But the greatest pressure remained producing a male heir. Jane understood the fate of the 2 wives before her. She knew her future and her life, depended on accomplishing what Catherine and Anne had failed to do. In 1537, Jane became pregnant. Henry was anxious and excited to the point of near madness. This time, he arranged everything perfectly. Jane received the best care, the finest physicians, and was protected from all stress. On October 12, 1537, after 2 days of difficult labour, Jane gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Henry named him Edward, after his grandfather. Henry was ecstatic. Finally, he had the male heir he had craved for nearly 3 decades. Jane had fulfilled a queen's sacred duty. But in medieval times, childbirth was always dangerous. 12 days after Edward's birth, Jane began running a high fever. In the era before antibiotics, postpartum infection was often fatal. Jane grew progressively weaker. On October 24th, she died at age 29. Henry grieved genuinely. Of all his wives, only Jane had given him what he wanted most, a son. He wouldn't marry again for 3 years, and when he died, he would be buried beside Jane. But Edward was still just a child. Henry needed another wife to secure the Tudor line, and this time he would seek a political alliance that could protect England from European threats. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, had a brilliant plan. He wanted to create an alliance with the Protestant German states to counter the Catholic power of France and Spain. And the best way to do this was through marriage. Anne of Cleves was the daughter of John, Duke of Cleves, a powerful Protestant lord in Western Germany. In 1539, Cromwell proposed Henry marry Anne to cement this alliance. There was one problem. Henry had never met Anne. He only had a portrait painted by Hans Holbein, the court painter. In the painting, Anne looked quite attractive. Fine features, kind eyes, and rich clothing. Henry agreed to the marriage. Anne departed from Cleves in December 1539. She travelled with a massive entourage and hundreds of chests containing her dowry. When she reached Calais, Henry was so excited he couldn't wait for the formal meeting. He decided to disguise himself and visit Anne early, a romantic tradition he had practiced with previous wives. But when Henry first met Anne on January 1st, 1540 at Rochester, he was completely shocked. Anne looked nothing like the portrait. She was taller than Henry expected, had pockmarked skin from smallpox, and, worst of all for Henry, she wasn't attractive. She spoke very poor English, couldn't dance in the English style, and had no musical skills. Henry was bitterly disappointed, but diplomatic agreements had been signed. He couldn't cancel the marriage without causing an international crisis. The wedding took place on January 6, 1540, in a gloomy atmosphere. Henry muttered, "If it were not to satisfy the world and my realm, I would not do that. I must do this day for none earthly thing." The wedding night was a complete disaster. Henry later testified to courtiers that he could not consummate the marriage with Anne. He declared her body disgusted him, and he had no desire for her. The marriage was never actually consummated. For the next 6 months, Henry sought every way to escape the marriage. He accused Anne of a prior betrothal in Germany, which wasn't true, and declared the marriage invalid. Anne, recognizing the danger, proved wiser than her predecessors. She agreed to divorce cooperatively. In exchange, Henry gave her a large financial settlement, 2 castles, and the title, the King's beloved sister. Anne would live comfortably in England until her death in 1557. Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged this disastrous marriage, was executed by Henry in July 1540. And Henry? He had already set his eyes on another young woman, one who would make him feel young and virile once again. Catherine Howard was only about 19 when she caught Henry's attention in 1540. She was the niece of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, one of England's most powerful nobles. With golden blonde hair, clear blue eyes, and porcelain-white skin, Catherine was described as a rose without a thorn. But Catherine's innocent appearance concealed a complicated past. Catherine grew up in the Norfolk household without strict supervision. As a teenager, she had relationships with Henry Manox, her music teacher, and later with Francis Derham, a young nobleman. In the 16th century world, these relationships could be considered actual marriage contracts. But Catherine concealed this past when she was brought to court to serve Anne of Cleves. Henry, now 49 and corpulent, was completely infatuated with Catherine. She was young, vivacious, and made him feel like a young man again. Unlike Anne of Cleves, Catherine knew how to please a man. She knew how to laugh at the right moments, how to look admiringly, and how to make Henry feel powerful and virile. On July 28, 1540, the same day Thomas Cromwell was executed, Henry secretly married Catherine at Oatlands Palace. She became his fifth wife, and Henry believed he had finally found happiness. The early months of marriage were like a dream. Henry showered Catherine with expensive jewellery, luxurious silk gowns, and called her his jewel of womanhood. He took her on hunting trips and festivals, showing off his beautiful young wife. But Catherine, despite being pampered like a princess, felt lonely in marriage to an old sick man. Henry now suffered from severe leg ulcers that made him frequently irritable and difficult. She began seeking comfort elsewhere. Thomas Culpeper, a handsome young nobleman who had been Henry's childhood friend, began having secret meetings with Catherine. What started as perhaps innocent conversations gradually became a dangerous relationship. Catherine wrote love letters to Culpeper. "You make me suffer from love for you." These letters would become evidence that condemned her. In autumn 1541, Catherine's past was finally discovered. John Lascelles, a former servant of the Howard family, revealed to Henry's advisors about Catherine's previous relationships with Henry Manox and Francis Dereham. Worse, he also knew about the secret meetings with Culpeper. Henry initially didn't believe it. He loved Catherine and couldn't accept that she had betrayed him. But as evidence mounted, the truth became undeniable. Henry was furious. This time it wasn't simply about not having sons. This was about honour and betrayal. Catherine had not only concealed her past, but possibly committed adultery while queen. Catherine was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London in November 1541. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who faced death courageously, Catherine completely collapsed. She was only 20 years old and couldn't understand why her luxurious life had suddenly become a nightmare. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed. Before her death, she was allowed to practice placing her head on the block so the execution could be performed quickly. Witnesses said she looked like a child, trembling and terrified. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were also executed for treason. Henry this time didn't remarry immediately. He aged considerably after Catherine's death. His health declined, and he began to realise his final days were approaching. Catherine Parr never intended to become queen. In 1543, at age 31, she was twice widowed and in love with Thomas Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother. She had experienced enough of life and wanted only some peace. But Henry VIII had set his sights on her. Catherine was completely different from previous wives. She was well-educated, intelligent, and most importantly, experienced. She knew how to live with difficult men and how to protect herself. When Henry proposed, Catherine couldn't refuse. Refusing the king was suicide, but she subtly set conditions for this marriage. First, she wanted to play the role of a good stepmother to Henry's 3 children, Mary, 27, Elizabeth, 10, and Edward, 6. These children had been separated from court and somewhat abandoned by Henry. Catherine wanted to reunite the family. Second, she wanted freedom to pursue learning and writing. Catherine was one of the most educated women in England at the time. She was fluent in Latin, French, Italian, and was a talented theologian. Henry agreed to both conditions. Their marriage took place on July 12, 1543, at Hampton Court Palace. This was the most private of all Henry's weddings, attended only by family and a few close courtiers. Catherine quickly proved herself an excellent queen and wonderful stepmother. She persuaded Henry to restore Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. She taught Edward advanced subjects and encouraged the boy's love of learning. With Elizabeth, she became like a real mother, teaching her history, languages, and most importantly, how to survive in a dangerous world for women. But Catherine also faced the greatest challenge. Henry was slowly dying. By 1546, Henry was severely obese, weighing about 300 pounds. His legs were heavily ulcerated and frequently infected, causing him constant pain and irritability. He became paranoid and violent. Anyone could become the next target of his rage. Catherine had to be careful with every word, every action. She knew Henry could still kill her at any moment if he felt threatened or displeased. In late 1546, Catherine nearly became Henry's victim. Her enemies at court, those who disliked her progressive religious views, convinced Henry she was plotting against him. A warrant for her arrest was prepared. But Catherine, with intelligence and survival instincts, saved herself. She approached Henry and cleverly convinced him that all her religious discussions were only to learn from his wisdom. She was so humble and submissive that Henry forgave her. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died at age 55. Edward, his 9-year-old son, became king as Edward VI. Catherine Parr had survived. She was Henry VIII's only wife to outlive him and die of natural causes. The story of Henry VI's 6 wives is a tragedy of love, power and survival. Each woman carried a piece of English history, and each paid a different price for marrying one of history's most tyrannical kings. Catherine of Aragon, the faithful wife, lived in exile until death, never abandoning her title as Queen of England. She died in 1536, just months after Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed history, paid with her life for her ambition. But her daughter Elizabeth would become Elizabeth I, one of the world's greatest queens, ruling England for 45 years and transforming it into a maritime superpower. Jane Seymour, the beloved wife, died for her duty but was Henry's most cherished memory. Her son Edward VI ruled England from 1547-1553, though he died young at 15. Anne of Cleves, the wise survivor, avoided death through cooperation and lived comfortably until 1557. Catherine Howard, the innocent young girl, paid with her life for youthful mistakes and ignorance about the dangers of royal power. Catherine Parr, the survivor, used intelligence and experience to endure and left an important legacy in educating Henry's children, especially Elizabeth. But perhaps the greatest legacy of these marriages was how they changed England's face forever. The divorce from Catherine of Aragon led to England's break from the Roman Church and establishment of the Church of England, an event that shaped England to this day. Henry's 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth and Edward, all became monarchs. Mary tried to return England to Catholicism and was called Bloody Mary for burning hundreds of Protestants. Edward ruled under regency and continued Protestant reform, but Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, would become the greatest queen, transforming England into a global empire. When we look back at the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, we see not just a personal tragedy, but a lesson about power, love, and the price of ambition. Henry began life as an ideal prince, handsome, intelligent, educated. But absolute power and obsession with having a son transformed him into a tyrant. He killed 2 of his 6 wives, divorced 2, and was truly happy with only one, Jane Seymour, who died giving birth to his heir. These 6 women represent different types of women in 16th century society. Catherine of Aragon was the traditional wife, loyal and religious. Anne Boleyn was a woman ahead of her time, intelligent, ambitious and independent. Jane Seymour was the ideal of the dutiful wife. Anne of Cleves was a victim of international politics. Catherine Howard was a young girl swept into a power game she didn't understand. Catherine Parr was the mature woman who used intelligence to survive. Each faced the same challenge: how to survive in a world where women were valued only for their ability to bear children, especially sons. Some failed tragically, some found ways to adapt, and some changed history itself. Their story reminds us that history is made not just by kings and emperors, but by brave women who lived, loved, and sometimes died for their beliefs and dreams. Thank you for joining me in exploring the story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives. This is one of history's greatest tragedies, a tale of love and betrayal, power and survival, ambition and tragedy. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to never miss our fascinating historical stories. Until next time, keep exploring the incredible secrets of our past